Prisons, staff numbers down, drugs up, and significantly deaths, particularly amongst women, up. Good evening. The crisis in English and Welsh prisons is deepening, most particularly affecting the deaths of women prisoners, 18 this year alone. The number of female deaths in jail is now the highest in a dozen years. The latest, a woman found dead in her cell 3 days ago in Manchester-style prison. Tonight, amid the swelling prisoner numbers and cuts in prison officers, we ask why, and we report on Natasha Chin, who was found dead in her prison cell, and we talk to her family.
She was arrested one day, spent the night in prison, and she died the next night.
Also tonight, the UN says migrant deaths in the Mediterranean have reached a record high, despite the number attempting the crossing falling by 2/3. Fasten your seatbelt, Zach. It could be a bumpy landing for the Richmond MP standing down over Heathrow. Labour MPs now join the Lib Dems in calling for a Brexit by-election. And fueling a diplomatic row, NATO takes on the Russian armada heading for Syria over their Spanish stopover.
Plus tonight, class in the American election. The left out, the unemployed, the dispossessed, the poor. Are they rooting for the man who claims to be their saviour?
I think to them we don't even exist. That's the way that they make us feel like we're not as important.
They have both been acting like two crybabies.
There's been an alarming increase in the number of female prisoners who've died in English jails this year. 18 deaths have been recorded, the highest figure for more than a decade. And although each incident is being independently investigated, there's growing concern about the conditions and checks that the prison service provides. It emerged in the last few hours that the latest prison death came on Sunday. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this report.
Within the last few hours, it's emerged 26-year-old Celeste Craig has become the 18th woman to have died in prison in England and Wales this year. She's another victim of a national prison crisis. She was found in her cell at Style Prison, the same jail which triggered a major government inquiry back in 2007 into the treatment of vulnerable women in the criminal justice system. Nearly half the deaths have been self-inflicted. Every one may be different, but each has left a family struggling to come to terms. This was an exceptional birthday to remember. There was cake, there were candles, and there were family and friends. The only person who wasn't there was the birthday girl herself.
Happy birthday.
For Natasha Chin had died in prison 3 months ago.
If she was here, she would be celebrating her 40th birthday, so we have to do that for her. I would like everyone to come up, one by one, everyone in the room, to light a candle in memory of Natasha.
These are not birthday candles, but were lit to remember. Natasha was found dead in her prison cell in July. It was very sudden, so sudden, her family and friends are still struggling to cope.
It's still unbelievable as I speak to know that she's actually not here. It's changed all of our life. We're all missing Tasha. We never would have thought something like this would have happened to our family member. It's just it's unbelievable.
Natasha is one of 17 women to have died in prison this year, the highest figure since 2004. Each case may be different, but that of the 40-year-old who was in a drug rehabilitation program is raising very serious concerns about the system.
But after all, this is too big.
The family have still not been able to bury her. The closest they have come to saying goodbye was at a memorial service inside Bronzefield Prison, where she was found dead. It had been arranged by her fellow prisoners. It was the only way they could pay their respects.
The chosen prisoners that organised the memorial, you could actually feel their sadness of Tasha's loss. They actually some of them knew Tasha for like 15 or 20 years, and they expressed that during the memorial. It was very emotional.
Natasha Chinn's death is the first inside Bronzefield prison for 6 years. There are reports that her cell alarm bell was ringing for 2 hours before help arrived, but there is no confirmation of that. And other inmates have told me that one prison officer spent 45 minutes trying to resuscitate her and was in tears when that failed. In response, Sodexo, in a statement, said,
"As with all deaths in custody, there will be an investigation by the Independent Prisons and Probation Ombudsman and an inquest. Therefore, we are unable to comment further at this stage."
This is the book that was given to us by the prison.
Many prisoners took to writing messages of condolence to the family. Natasha's death had resonated throughout the jail.
So many people have gone out and put their effort out for Natasha to let us know that how much they will actually miss her. So it was really touching.
She'd been a cocaine and heroin addict for much of her life. Pickpocketing mainly paid for the drugs. But it was breaches of her probation conditions which sent her back to jail the day before she died.
Even when you're asked by friends, what happened to your sister, you can't actually answer the question because you don't actually know exactly what happened. You just know that she was arrested one day, spent the night in prison, and she died the next night. It's very sad. It hurts us deep down inside to know that Tasha's not here and we don't know why she's not here.
But the family of Natasha Chinn are not alone. Imagine similar thoughts being repeated over and over again among the families of the other 16 women to have died in prison so far this year, like 38-year-old Nicola Lawrence, who died in Newhall in September, Emily Hartley, who died in the same prison 5 months earlier, and Sarah Reed, Holloway Prison's last casualty before it closed.
This is for Tasha. Tasha, I love you.
Happy birthday to you.
A long-awaited plan from the Justice Secretary Liz Truss is imminent. Deaths, self-harm and violence in prisons remain at record levels, while staff have been cut by a third. But any plan is too late for Natasha Chinn's family. They can only hope that many of the factors that led to her death can be avoided in the future.
Simon Israel, and we only were able to confirm the death of the 18th woman in prison last Sunday, just before we came on air. Joining us now is Juliet Lyon, who has just been appointed by the government as chair of the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody. And I know you've only been in the job 2 weeks, but you've been working on prison matters for at least the last 20 years.
Yes.
What is your sense of why there is this sudden and very nasty increase in deaths of women in prison?
Well, that's something the IOP is looking into right now, because what we saw was deaths were quite high. Baroness Corson was asked to write a report. We're talking back now in 2007 when that report was produced about vulnerable women. Since then, the deaths have gone down, and now suddenly they've started to go up. It does coincide with the reduction in staffing levels that we heard about on the programme. It does coincide with a reduction in time out of cell, time with other women, but that doesn't explain it entirely. The level of mental health need is so high, the level of vulnerability is so high, the need to combat addictions, and above all, John, really, the need to protect and prevent, work with these women ahead of this. This is so late in the day.
There's another figure you haven't mentioned, which is out of control, and that is drugs in prison.
Yes, yes.
And I mean, after all, here was a prisoner that we've profiled here who had a drug problem and who died very quickly after she got into prison. I mean, it's quite clear, it just sounds very much as if there weren't the staff to deal with this sort of a situation.
I mean, there will, of course, be an individual investigation, and that's really important. It's important for 2 reasons: so that the family know what happened, and that'll be the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, and then there'll be an inquest and a coroner's report. But actually, what we're seeing is that time and again, the same kind of messages and recommendations are coming out of these reports. And what I'm really really passionate about is that those lessons are learned, that they are embedded, and that government makes them an absolutely top priority.
But of course, I mean, your commission is your advisory panel is on deaths in custody. I mean, how wide can you go? Because, I mean, you have to look at staffing. You have to look at whether too many women are being jailed. The wrong women are being jailed. I mean, in a sense, there may be offences that really they don't need to go to jail for. Can you go that far?
I think we can. I mean, this government has made a commitment to reduce the number of women in prison. You know, it'd be interesting to hear whether the Justice Secretary is able to talk about that next week. I think that the white paper is due out very soon. Whether there's a commitment to really reduce the number of vulnerable women and vulnerable people, and whether we can work, as we can in the panel, across the Department of Health and the NHS and across the Home Office, so that we can actually look at solutions that don't lie in prison. Because the temptation is always to say, how can we improve the prison environment? Well, of course things can happen in prison. Care can be improved, healthcare can be improved, lots of things could be better. But your point's really important. A lot of these solutions lie in safe housing for women, better mental health care, better facilities in the community to keep them safe.
And very briefly, I mean, Michael Gove, whatever else he's famous for, was known to have some pretty radical ideas of changing the situation in prison. Is that to be continued, or do you see a big change already?
Well, I know that there's a real effort to bring together the emphasis on safety, which is vital, because prisons have become less safe in the last few years, and reform. And that's really important. And remember that the Prime Minister has already prioritised vulnerability and vulnerable people, and really that needs to be put into action here.
Juliet Lyon, thank you very much indeed for coming in. And tomorrow night, we'll be reporting from the high security prison in Norway, where they operate a pioneering drug treatment scheme for inmates which aims to cut reoffending levels on their release.
Any drugs or just particular?
Cocaine, I like.
Cocaine?
Yeah.
Well, you can't get that here.
Yeah, if you want.
Can you?
Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah. But
Gosh.
you have to order it if you want it.
Gosh.
Now, hundreds of civilians have been evacuated from villages around the city of Mosul as the Iraqi army moves to retake the city held by so-called Islamic State. This after the UN warned that IS fighters have committed widespread human rights abuses as they seek to defend the city. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, travelled to a refugee camp near Mosul today, where he met some of the 10,000 displaced people still living just a few miles from the fighting.
The road to Mosul is paved with bad intentions. The smouldering oil drums and tyres of ISIS fighters who hoped the smoke would save them from coalition airstrikes, and the skeletons of cars driven by suicide bombers towards the front line. Behind this wall of earth lies a village called Bazwaya, this the border of a shrinking caliphate of fear. Bazwaya is the only village now lying between us and Mosul, which lies 6 miles down the road from here. At this rate, Iraqi special forces will be in the suburbs of the city within the next few days. All the homes lie abandoned, but this one is full of surprises. For if and when the owners return, they will find a Russian T-54 tank parked in their living room. An attempt by the jihadists to hide it from airstrikes. Running along the back garden is an ISIS tunnel stretching for hundreds of meters, complete with breathing holes for the fighters below. Last night, Iraqi troops thought they heard somebody inside, so they fired into it and set it alight. And villagers who survived the fierce bombardment of the last 10 days are now leaving, heading through the fields to freedom after enduring more than 2 years of ISIS rule. This dusty refugee camp is the home which awaits them. The men of fighting age at first held at gunpoint amid checks they are not ISIS militants themselves. Along the outside of the camp fence, the tiers of new arrivals. Those who escaped ISIS before the militants arrived, now reunited with those who were trapped and couldn't leave till now. Inside, some are still too afraid to speak. They have relatives in Mosul and they fear reprisals. But a primary school teacher and his family told us life under ISIS had been a catastrophe.
We couldn't disobey them. We had to wear long beards. And if we missed the mosque, they would take down our names. Then there was a hellish battle. Rockets, airstrikes. One airstrike was aimed at a suicide vehicle just 40 meters from our house.
Over 10,000 have been displaced since this offensive began, 1,000 arriving here this morning. And as the army advances towards Mosul, many more are expected to arrive. And today they were relieved but exhausted after more than 2 years of being torn apart. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Northern Iraq.
Well, now the conflict in Iraq and Syria is one of the driving forces behind the huge numbers of refugees fleeing the Middle East and beyond. But it's not the whole picture. The United Nations has said that the numbers killed trying to cross the Mediterranean have reached a record high, with almost 3,800 deaths so far this year. Today, another 25 migrants were found dead in a rubber boat. A warning, there are some distressing scenes in Diana Magne's report.
These are the lucky ones. We can't see the boat that brought them here, just the dozens who cling for dear life to the rescue tube thrown out by the Italian Coast Guard. The desperation on this man's face as he's hauled into the boat.
Come. Wait, one moment.
The calls for calm. It's a small boat and there are many men and women who want to get on it.
Okay.
This familiar story. Yesterday, 342 migrants rescued by a Maltese-based NGO. Young families who've paid a high price to get their loved ones to safety. Young men hoping for work in Europe that's better and safer than what they left behind.
Before 1 year, there is 50-50. You can live in Libya. But now there is very difficult to stay in Libya because they kidnap people, they beat people very badly, and they are very brutal. That's why we decided to go Italy.
And here the ones who weren't so lucky. 9 of these forlorn processions down the gangplank at a port in Sicily, taken away for a burial at least more dignified than their gruesome deaths at sea. The medical charity Doctors Without Borders today published photos from another migrant rescue, a rubber dinghy desperately overcrowded. 107 people pulled to safety, some of them needing treatment for chemical burns. 25 found dead in the bottom of the boat, killed after they inhaled fuel, MSF believes. The journey from Libya is the most deadly across the Mediterranean, with some of the heaviest migrant traffic. Last year, there were 3 times as many people crossing into Europe, but already this year, more have died or gone missing, 3,800, and those are the ones we know about. It's not the story the people smugglers tell. They promise that Europe will come to the rescue, and mostly Europe does.
Where previously smugglers were launching off of Libya's coast, trying to get a boat full of people 160 nautical miles all the way to Europe, the growing number of warships in the Mediterranean made it much easier. Instead of going 160 nautical miles, they just had to go 12 to get out into international waters. Migrants traveled alone, and they were told, call the Coast Guard after 3 hours and you'll be picked up.
But the Coast Guard cannot pick up everyone. And with ever more sophisticated smuggling networks, the numbers who die on the crossing will only continue to rise.
Diana Magne reporting. Well, now we're joined from Geneva by William Spindler from the UN Refugee Agency. William Spindler, it seems that one route, the safest one might say, across obviously from the Middle East to Greece, has effectively been, well, not shut down, but reduced very significantly. But that has left people crossing by an infinitely more dangerous route. And therefore the numbers, although your refugees are down, the numbers of deaths are up.
Yes, that's correct. The route between Libya and Italy is far more dangerous because the distances involved are much greater. And we are talking about open sea as opposed to only a few miles between the coast of Turkey and the Greek islands. Here we're talking about strong currents, about open sea, and the chances of people dying are much higher. We estimate that for every 47 people who make it, 1 person dies. This is an absolute humanitarian catastrophe.
Well, what does your agency want done?
We think that people will continue to die because this is the only option that they have. The sea is Europe's last open border. And as long as people are desperately fleeing war, persecution and poverty, they will take these risks. So what we would like is for more legal, safe alternatives for refugees, for the most vulnerable refugees, to travel safely to Europe and other parts of the world. By this we mean resettlement, family reunification, student visas, and so on. We need to make this possible so that people can travel safely without risking their lives in this way. At the same time, we need to help the countries that are hosting the vast majority of refugees so that these refugees can stay where they are at the moment.
Well, what sort of measures are you trying to get with the Libyan authorities? I mean, what about reception camps in Libya that in some way catch people before they actually set sail, and equally measures, very strong measures against the smugglers themselves? I mean, cannot more be done on the African coast itself?
Well, the situation in Libya being what it is, it's not possible to keep people there in safety. The reason why many people are traveling at the moment is because of the insecurity in Libya. So what we need to do is to help people where they are before they go into these long, dangerous journeys. We need to improve things like governance, respect for human rights, deal with the conflicts that are pushing people to leave. So these things are absolutely necessary. But at the same time, we need to find alternatives for people to travel in a safe way. And yes, it's very well to crack down on smugglers. This is an organized business that is being done almost on an industrial scale. So we need to fight that. But that's not going to work if people will still be willing to risk their lives because they have no other alternative.
William Spindler, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Geneva. And I do apologise for the delay on that interview.
Now, fires spread through the migrant camp in Calais, known as the Jungle today, as the last residents were cleared out by police. It's unclear who set a handful of tents and shelters alight last night. French authorities say they will stop processing people this evening. The last buses taking migrants and refugees to relocation centres across the country will set off shortly. The charity Save the Children claimed that the authorities have failed to provide accommodation for 60 children who remain in the area, and it estimates that a further 100 are unaccounted for. The row over Heathrow's projected third runway becomes more political by the hour. But could Brexit become a big issue in the by-election Zac Goldsmith triggered yesterday, which he wants to be all about Heathrow? The Conservatives say they won't field a candidate. The Lib Dems are hoping to repeat their massive swing in the Witney by-election. Our political editor, Gary Gibbons, reports from the Richmond Park constituency in southwest London.
3,000 feet above the heads of the voters of Richmond, Zac Goldsmith hopes these jets will propel him back into Parliament as an independent.
I'm dead against a new runway at Heathrow. I guess anybody who lives in Richmond is. And I'm all for Zac.
I'm not going to vote for Zac. I think he's a self-indulgent prat. Thank you.
Even though he's stood down as a Conservative MP and is running as an independent, Theresa May has decided the Conservatives will not be running an official party candidate against Zac Goldsmith. So if voting for Zac Goldsmith sends a tough message to Theresa May and the government, why is she supporting you?
Well, the party's not supporting
Of
me.
course it is. She's not standing
that's
here. She wants you to win.
That's a misreading of the situation.
No, it's not.
The reality is, and I can't look, it's not for me to speak for Theresa May or even the party nationally, but I can speak for my party locally, and we are as one. And that makes it very hard for the National Party to then impose a candidate where there is absolutely no appetite for an independent, for a Conservative candidate in this by-election. So the party's responding to that. I'm thrilled they have, but it's...
So Theresa May doesn't want you to win, or she does want you to win?
I haven't discussed
Looks to me as though she does want you to win.
I hope she does. I hope that she would value hope she'd value my position on the backbenches.
Big message that sends then to her if you win.
But I think you're misreading the situation.
Tim Farron believes the Tories aren't standing because they feared a split Conservative vote might hand the seat to the Lib Dems. Overturning a 23,000 majority is a tall order, but his party will attempt that, campaigning against Heathrow expansion and against Theresa May's approach to Brexit.
And there are literally thousands of jobs on the line because Theresa May has chosen to interpret a narrow win for Leave in June and turn it to an extreme version of Brexit, which will damage lives around here. That direction can be halted by a Liberal Democrat win here in this by-election.
Well, some people will say you're just trying to rerun the referendum, which you lost.
Well, I'd take the view that of the 52% who voted to leave, none of them were asked, shall we leave the single market?
If anywhere in the country is up for that argument, Tim Farron hopes it's prosperous Richmond. A Lib Dem seat in the past. Nearly 2/3 of the voters here are graduates. Around 70% backed Remain in the referendum, unlike Zac Goldsmith.
It'll be a tough fight. But thank goodness the Conservatives aren't putting somebody up, so he's got a clear run in that respect.
They're obviously terrified.
We're not terrified.
That the Lib Dems could take it.
Not terrified.
What's a better word for it? Anxious.
Possibly. Possibly, yes.
Do you think they might want to use their vote in the by-election to protest about Brexit?
I think so. There is a lot of intelligentsia here, so they have a little bit more insight in what's going on and what it means.
Today, 3 Labour MPs, frontbenchers Clive Lewis and Jonathan Reynolds, backbencher Lisa Nandy, lobbied for Labour not to stand in the by-election. In an online article, they said if there is any chance of kicking Goldsmith out of Parliament, the vote against him must not be split. That's why we think Labour should consider not standing a candidate in this by-election. Labour insists it won't stand aside from this intense political fight.
I don't mind about Heathrow.
Do you think you might be the only person in Richmond of that opinion?
I think I might be. I might be. Yes.
A lot of people in Richmond voted for staying in the European Union. The Lib Dems are rather hoping the two issues might blur and help them.
Yes, I think they might. I voted Brexit.
So you're quite lonely on a number of grounds.
I am, I'm afraid. Yes, I'd probably be lynched.
The government gets to choose the date of this by-election, and it's expected to announce as soon as tomorrow a campaign that's as brief as possible.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, we stay on politics with an internal investigation by UKIP, which has handed Mike Hookham a formal reprimand, but it stopped short of suspending him for allegedly taking part in an altercation with fellow MEP Stephen Woolfe at the European Parliament. Mr. Woolfe was hospitalised after the incident in Strasbourg. Mr. Hookham has denied hitting or punching him. Gary is in Westminster. Gary, tell us more.
Here it is in all its majesty, 6 pages of text, the investigation into how 2 grown men elected politicians got into a room and one of them ended up in hospital. The Warren Commission into President Kennedy's death, this is not. It has a picture of the ante-room, which is the sort of grassy knoll where the 2 men disappeared into, but they were the only men in that room. And the conclusion of the report is that although they blame Mr. Woolfe in this report for starting it, they say the true facts as to what actually happened are impossible to determine because the 2 men's accounts diverge so much. UKIP would like that to be the end of the matter. Martin Schulz, the President of the European Parliament, has got very different ideas. He's now referred the entire matter to the French State Prosecutor's Office in Strasbourg. And a little earlier on today, he and the leader of the EPP, centre-right group in the European Parliament, both of them implied that Stephen Woolfe had indeed been punched. That prompted Mike Hookham, the other MEP in this saga, to make this verbal attack.
Earlier today, Mr. Weber made a defamatory statement against me, which you supported. Can I ask that both you gentlemen leave this building where you don't have parliamentary immunity and repeat those statements so I can take legal action against you?
Martin Schulz's response to that, he'd be all too pleased to see him in court.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Now, Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, has warned that the impasse over the EU's trade deal with Canada shows it is vital for the UK to sort out its own arrangement before it leaves the Union. The pact with Canada was due to be signed at a summit tomorrow after 7 years of talks. That's now stalled after one regional government in Belgium dissented from the deal. Last-minute talks continued in Belgium today as the national government tried to convince the region of Wallonia to drop its opposition. Mr. Fox said if a new trade deal for the UK is struck in 2 years after the triggering of Article 50, it will be based on a majority vote in the European Council. But after the UK has left, any deal could fall victim to the same delays as the Canadian pact.
So it's in the interest, quite clearly following this experience, for all concerned to minimise any sort of economic, trade and political disruption, to ensure that's done with the minimal of fuss, and it's done through that QMV process by Council rather than being negotiated from outside as CETA was done.
In America, the Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump is fighting back after sliding in the polls nationally, with his rival Hillary Clinton gaining ground in states once thought to be solidly conservative. But is it all too late? And why is he today taking time out to open his new hotel in Washington, D.C.? Our US correspondent Kylie Morris is in the swing state of North Carolina. Kylie, what is he doing?
Well, it is unorthodox, Jackie, certainly 13 days out from an election to take time to open a five-star hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. The rooms are $400 a night, by the way. But it is very Donald Trump. He effectively turned it into a kind of mix of a campaign appearance and effectively a Trump infomercial. Let's have a listen to what he said.
We were dramatically ahead of schedule on this project and under budget. We turned a property that had been neglected for decades and which was losing huge sums of money for the federal government into a major revenue producer and job creator. This is what I want to do for our country, and this is what we're working so hard to do.
In truth, judging by the polls as they currently stand, there is a very real risk that that hotel on Pennsylvania is about as close as Donald Trump is going to get to the White House. I mean, make no mistake, he's still in this race. That's why he's coming here to North Carolina this afternoon. Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama will be here tomorrow. But he's running out of time. Already 10 million people have voted in early voting. And certainly when you come to a place like this and you look at the ground game, he stages these massive rallies in airport hangars. But here you find on the ground, Hillary Clinton has staff numbers rivaling his kind of 4 to 1. So she's very effective at getting people out the door, getting people out to vote and building a kind of a momentum behind her campaign. I think the real danger is that she also has very strong surrogates. Michelle Obama, for example, is coming here tomorrow. She has been able to drive up her percentage among women. Remember, Donald Trump used that slur against Hillary Clinton in the debate last week, calling her a nasty woman. Well, that's now been turned on its head, and Democrats, certainly here, Democratic students are embracing that, calling themselves nasty women, because they are very aware that women, nasty or not, do vote. So that is the message for Donald Trump now. He is wrangling around, trying to move quickly between different states to try and drive up his vote. But it's almost too late, and the Democrats are celebrating that, now trying to take the Senate, not only the presidency, but to take the Senate away from the Republicans. Jackie.
Kylie, thanks very much for that. Well, it's too simplistic of you to categorise many of the people who do support Donald Trump as poor and white. But a number of his core backers are found in some of the most run-down areas of the US, places where jobs have disappeared completely and drugs are now a part of everyday life. These are the places depicted in the best-selling memoir Hillbilly Elegy, which explores and goes some way to explain the class divisions in America. I'll be speaking to the author J.D. Vance shortly. But first, I've just returned from Kentucky, where I've been finding out what life is like in one of America's poorest communities. If Donald Trump is looking to appeal to a forgotten America, this is where he'll find it.
I hurt myself today.
Isolated, and not just by geography, this is one of the poorest areas in the country, where the need for change is born of desperation.
Oh, look at that. Well, there's the baby. There's the baby.
Hello, what a beautiful baby. At the end of a dirt track on the road out of Beattyville, the trailer where Janice Clubb has raised her 5 grandchildren. Her daughter first sending them to stay for a couple of days. And that was how many years ago?
12. Maybe about 12 years.
Janice's daughter and son-in-law, like so many here in Lee County, were both addicted to drugs. What drugs were they taking?
I think just about anything they could get a hold of, probably meth, They were using the needle, pain pills, nerve pills, and it was just so heartbreaking. It was just so sad. I felt really bad, you know, for the children, because children need their parents.
Drug deaths have climbed steadily across Kentucky. What started as a problem with prescription medicine has morphed into heroin and crystal meth. Locals say the latest drug of choice is liquid gold, a potent mix of drain cleaner boiled up and injected with heroin. The impact on families and the community, devastating.
What was it like for you knowing that your daughter had become a drug addict?
It was so depressing. I never would have believed she would have. It hurt so much. I'm sorry.
Shame is not an issue for Alyssa. She says half the children in her school are living with grandparents, their parents dead or lost to addiction. Her story is told with a matter-of-fact acceptance.
It was more of like, Mom, you're going on vacation. So I was like, okay, that's fun. So I went to my grandma. She's like, I'll be back in 2 weeks. So I thought she was going to be back. 2 weeks went by. I was like, sort of missing her. I was like, where's Mom? And so then 2 more weeks went by, and it just kept adding up.
Alyssa wants to break the mould, be the first in her family to graduate from high school, make her grandmother proud.
But given that she's looked after you, given that it was given her so much sadness what happened to your mum, how much do you want to do well for her?
A lot, because I'm really like all that's left. So yeah, definitely whatever I do, I want it to make her happy though.
While all Janice's hopes lie in God and her granddaughter, a lifetime of hardship means she's under no illusions about what politicians can deliver. If she votes at all, it'll be for Trump.
I don't know if either one of them would do anything. I don't. They have both been acting like two crybabies.
In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson came here to eastern Kentucky to launch his war on poverty. The aim not just to relieve the symptoms, but to cure it, to prevent it. Here in Lee County, more than a third of people still live in poverty, relying on the sort of government assistance instigated by Johnson for their very survival. As jobs have disappeared, a drugs epidemic has taken hold, and clinging on to hope becomes harder by the day.
Too cold for me. Too cold.
72-year-old Lucy Cordell lives here with 7 other members of her family.
So just tell me again, Lucy, about how would you describe the state of your home?
It's in poor condition. I'm ashamed you might come in and see.
With no one in the house working, they rely on disability benefit and food stamps. And Lucy's story has a familiar ring. She too has taken on a relative's child, the mother abandoning the baby because of drugs.
She just gave him away, and I took him. She just walked off and left him. Was run off with some man. And she said she'd be back in a couple of months. But I said, well, when you come back, you needn't expect to get the baby because you're not getting him. So I gave him. I've had him 13 years.
To say Lucy feels powerless is an understatement.
Max! That's enough!
She can't even get the landlord to fix the ceiling. She isn't sure she'll bother to vote, unconvinced any politician can help her either.
Do you worry what will happen when you're gone?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's a constant worry for me. I hope before I pass away that they all have jobs, and they can have their own place to live.
But it's a worry.
Yeah, it's a worry.
Migration is a big part of Kentucky's story. After coal, oil and farming left the state, so did huge swathes of its people. These men among them, who went away not to make their fortune, but just to make a living. Back home to retire, Trump's promise of making America great again appeals after decades of feeling neglected.
I feel like we need a change.
We've been sold out.
By whom?
The government.
Our government. And all they do is fill their pockets full, and you're left standing on the corner looking for a job. These caps we got on is made in Japan or foreign countries.
And what do you feel about that?
China, yeah, China. I mean, you take 10 hats off people's heads down through here, and there might be 1 out of the 10 that's USA made. Even the American flags.
And what do you feel about that?
Well, I feel hurt by it.
And it's a hurt not eased by millions of dollars, 14 million this year alone, given by government to help improve the economy of eastern Kentucky. At the local newspaper offices, an unpopular view that years of assistance isn't helping people here to help themselves.
The community doesn't move on because there's no reason to. It's like anything else. If what they provide meets your basic needs, if you have a cell phone, if you have a couple extra bucks so you can go buy some things, then there's no need to move on, especially if there's no one encouraging you to do that.
Kind of think about going back in January.
Back on the porches of Beattyville, and Tracy Wilner will probably vote for Clinton. But the feeling remains that for all the politicians and the rest of America, the people here are just not good enough.
They don't come to these towns around here.
Why not? Why do you think they don't?
I really, honestly, I think to them we don't even exist. That's the way that they make us feel like we're not as important. They took the farming away, they took the tobacco away, they took the coal mines away. Basically, they took everything away.
If I could start again.
While there's a desperate desire for change here, there's resignation that much will probably remain the same. Hanging on to hope and pride is hard when you feel everything else slipping away.
I would find a way.
Well, I'm joined live from San Francisco by the author J.D. Vance. His best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, depicts what it's like to grow up white and poor in America, and it's taken the country by storm. J.D. Vance, drug problems, joblessness, poverty, parents abandoning or unable to look after their children, that's familiar to you, isn't it? That's your story.
Yes, unfortunately, it's very familiar to me. It's what I write about in the book. And if you look at the data, or if you just go and talk to some of the folks who live in eastern Kentucky or southern Ohio like you did, you realize that those stories are awfully common, too common, I think.
I mean, that's exactly right. We stopped people randomly in the street, and all of them said they knew somebody who'd been affected by drugs or had been brought up by grandparents. What has gone wrong in these communities?
Well, I think partially you saw it when you visited eastern Kentucky, is that the economy in this area has been really hard hit. You know, these are areas that depended on coal mines, on steel mills, on a lot of other manufacturing industries that just don't exist anymore, or at least don't exist in quite the volume needed to support a local economy. So what's happened is that as people have lost jobs, as people have lost hope, they've really, I think in some ways, turned over to other habits or other things to try to dull that pain. And that's a big part of where this opioid crisis comes from. It's not just people who like drugs or want to be addicted to drugs. It's that they're really trying to find something to do, something to dull that pain that comes from living in areas that are really struggling.
I mean, you describe it in your book as a cultural crisis. What is it about white, working class, poor communities that is in crisis, would you say? What is it about the lifestyle, if you like, or the culture?
Well, I think that the biggest problem is that folks have really lost hope in these communities. And so one of the things I realized when I was a kid, one of the things my grandma really recognized in me, is that there was a certain cultural message that I was getting from my neighborhood, from my family, from the people around me, that there really wasn't any hope left, that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how hard you tried to get ahead, it wasn't going to result in anything. And I think it's important to recognize that life is unfair in these communities. I'm sure you saw it when you visited. But there's also something important to be said for continuing to believe that you have some control over your life, that you have some agency over your life. And when people have lost that, it really creates a lot of self-destructive tendencies.
Of course, elections are often seen as a time of hope, you know, potential for change. Can you explain why some of the poorest people in America would look at the billionaire Donald Trump and think, yes, he speaks for me?
Yeah, well, of course, it's not just the poorest Americans. It's lower and middle income Americans who are also supporting Donald Trump. And what really his support comes from, I think, is that folks have thought for the past 30 or 40 years that politicians on both parties, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, have made a lot of promises, have said that things are going to get a lot better, but really these communities have continued to go in a negative direction. Things haven't gotten a whole lot better. And so Donald Trump is the first politician from either party in a long time to come along and say, we need to go in a radically different direction. We need to renegotiate trade deals. We need to radically rethink our approach to immigration. You may not agree with him, but in an area that's felt so ignored for so long, the fact that he's even talking about a new direction has a lot of appeal.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that very poor black communities or Hispanic communities tend to vote Democrat. What is it about white communities that make them attracted to Donald Trump?
Well, a lot of it just goes back to the history of American politics. And, 40 or so years ago, the Republicans really made a strategic choice that they were going to go after primarily white voters. And if they were going to go after minority voters at all, it was going to be more upscale minority voters. So you've definitely seen over the past 40 years that that's had consequences, and minority groups in the United States have consistently gravitated towards the Democrats. What the Republicans represent, I think, separate for poor white Americans, is really a cultural home for a lot of people who feel very frustrated by what we in America call the coastal elite, so the people living in California or in New York. The Republicans have really made a point of making a party out of the middle part of the country, and they've had success.
J.D. Vance, have to end it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, John.
After the break, sailing through another international diplomatic spat, this time over refueling, the Russian Navy battle group heads through the Mediterranean to the Syrian conflict. There's been yet another diplomatic spat over the imminent arrival of the Russian Navy battle group and its greater firepower in the Mediterranean. Apparent Russian requests for refueling in Spain, a NATO member, were greeted with horror and consternation, but then denied and disowned. The incident, though, has brought into sharp focus the concerns over the sheer firepower that the Russian ships are bringing to the Syrian conflict. Paul McNamara has this report.
Watched on from afar by all it passes last night by the Portuguese Air Force. It may roll in the deep out here, but this Russian armada is dropping no speed as it crashes through the choppy waters of international diplomacy. The Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier and its fleet of support craft is en route to Syria, but last night asked Spain for help refueling and resupplying, just hours before Spanish officials took their seat at a NATO conference in front of the world's media. The man smiling here is NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The smile soon drops as he meets Spanish Defense Minister Pedro Morenes. These comments the night before explain the tension.
The battle group may be used to increase Russia's ability to take part in combat operations over Syria and to conduct even more airstrikes against Aleppo.
Tensions mounted overnight. This morning, Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon had this message for Spain.
We'd be extremely concerned that any NATO member should consider assisting a Russian carrier group that might end up bombing Syrian civilians.
The problem for Spain today was that it has resupplied Russian ships in the past, 60 times in the last few years according to some reports. But they weren't during a NATO conference, with tensions heightened over Syria. Fortunately for Spain, Russia backed down today, first saying they withdrew their request, then saying they never made a request in the first place. Either way, a propaganda coup back in Mother Russia.
it will be used to propagate the idea that Russia is the strong country, that they are friendly, they are cooperative, they can offer friendship to the NATO, and that is that good sign that NATO is bad force when they reject friendship. So that is good for propaganda purposes domestically.
The real concern, though, is what the planes on that aircraft carrier do when they get to Syria. This is a village outside Idlib today. 17 people, mostly children, were reportedly killed when these bombs dropped next to a school, according to the activists who shot this footage. We don't know if the plane that did this was Russian. We do know that they have been active here in the past. For NATO, a diplomatic bullet was dodged today. For Syria, the might of the Russian military is still heading their way.
Paul McNamara reporting tonight's main news. There's been an alarming increase in the number of female prisoners who've died in English jails this year. 18 deaths have been recorded.
Well, that's it from us for now.
We'll be back tomorrow at 7, but that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.